The train rattled and groaned through the freezing Wisconsin night. Inside, a group of Japanese soldiers huddled together, their faces hollow, eyes sunken, uniforms torn and filthy. They were survivors of a nightmare that stretched across the Pacific. Soldiers who had marched through sweltering jungles, survived ambushes and clawed their way through starvation. Each man had been trained to believe one thing above all: surrender was the ultimate shame. Capture was worse than death. To be taken alive was to lose honor forever. And yet, here they were, alive, trembling, and afraid of something they had never prepared for. The soldiers' breaths puffed in the icy air, mist swirling in the dim light of the train car. Each clink of the metal rails against frozen ground echoed like a warning. They whispered to each other, voices low and tense. "This is a trick," one muttered, his teeth chattering. Another's hands shook as he adjusted his ragged uniform. Every sound from outside, every crunch of snow beneath boots, set their nerves on edge. They had trained for bullets, grenades, and the merciless charge of war, but they had never trained for kindness. Finally, the train screeched to a halt. The doors rattled and clattered open, and the soldiers froze. A gust of freezing wind cut through the car, biting through their thin layers. They stepped onto the packed snow, bracing for chaos. They expected shouting, gunfire, punishment, cruelty. They had imagined the Americans as merciless barbarians, ready to exact revenge for the suffering in the Pacific. But what greeted them was something entirely unexpected. Before them stood guards, yes, armed and watchful, but orderly, precise, almost calm. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from brick chimneys nearby, carrying the rich, comforting smell of cooking food. Lights glowed warmly from barracks windows, reflecting off the snow. The scene was eerily calm, almost inviting. The prisoners' hearts beat faster, a mix of fear and confusion. Some exchanged glances, suspicion written clearly in their eyes. "What trick is this?" one whispered. The Red Cross officials were the next shock. They stood on the sidelines, clipboards in hand, watching with quiet authority. Neutral, unarmed, impartial. Here was a presence the prisoners had never anticipated. In their minds, Americans ignored treaties and rules. Yet here these observers ensured that everything would be done by the book. The soldiers blinked, unable to reconcile the reality with the horror stories drilled into them since childhood. As they were herded forward, the prisoners felt the stiffness of fear in their limbs. Every step was measured, every command sharp and clear in English. Interpreters guided them. "Line up. Do not break formation." Each second felt like a trap. The soldiers expected sudden violence, an explosion of cruelty at any moment. But nothing came. No insult, no strike, no mockery. Just orderly commands and careful eyes watching them. The barracks themselves were another surprise. Not lavish, but heated, lined with bunks and thick wool blankets. The soldiers stared at the simple comfort with disbelief. Some sat heavily on the mattresses, testing the softness, hesitant to believe their own senses. Others just held their breath, unwilling to let themselves relax. They had been told that prisoners were reduced to animals, starved, beaten, and humiliated. Yet here, in this snow-covered corner of Wisconsin, the enemy offered them safety. The tension was thick, almost unbearable. Fear remained, yes, but it was now mixed with confusion. They could not trust this calm, this warmth. Was it a trap? Were they about to be punished for believing their eyes? The soldiers moved in silence, whispers running like currents down the line. Some could not look at the guards, afraid that recognition of kindness would betray weakness. Others, more curious, studied the faces around them, American, orderly, disciplined, yet not cruel. Even small acts caused internal shock. A guard reached down to steady an elderly prisoner, offering a firm grip without mockery. Another corrected a step, guiding a man over slippery snow. Nothing was cruel, nothing was humiliating. Each gesture, no matter how minor, added to the impossible confusion. The soldiers had been trained to expect hate, violence, and terror. Instead, they faced order, efficiency, and, most disorienting of all, basic decency. By the time they entered the camp proper, every man was on edge, heart hammering. They had survived battles and jungle starvation, endured the unspeakable. Yet this new challenge, facing an enemy who treated them like humans, was unlike anything they had ever imagined. The prisoners looked around once more at the lit barracks, the smoke curling from chimneys, the guards standing tall yet calm. For the first time in months, perhaps years, their minds struggled to accept reality. This was not what war had taught them to expect. And in that moment, with the wind howling and snow crunching under their feet, they faced a question far more terrifying than death. What would come next in a place where the enemy did not hate them? The prisoners had barely taken their first steps into Camp McCoy when the next surprise struck. They were used to fear, to the sharp crack of orders, to the sting of hunger and the ache of exhaustion. But here the world seemed different. Not safe, not completely, but disorientingly controlled, almost gentle. The first stop was the medical inspection. The soldiers shuffled forward, wary, muscles tense. Many expected mockery, harsh words, or even a sharp slap for being too slow. They had prepared for humiliation, trained to endure pain. But nothing prepared them for the quiet efficiency of the American medics. One soldier, his arm heavily bandaged and badly infected, froze as a medic approached. His mind screamed that the medic would sneer, pull off the bandages roughly, maybe even strike him. Instead, the man knelt carefully, inspecting the wound. He cleaned it, applied new gauze, and bandaged it again, moving slowly and methodically. The prisoner sat rigid, heart hammering, unable to reconcile what he saw with everything he had been taught about the enemy. Around him, others faced similar disbelief. Soldiers with lice-infested uniforms, swollen stomachs from starvation, hollow eyes from months of jungle campaigns, all were treated with the same care. No one shouted. No one struck. No one laughed at their weakness. The quiet professionalism was almost unbearable. Some prisoners whispered to each other, disbelief dripping from every word. Why? Why are they doing this? We are their enemies. It wasn't just the medics. Guards, too, behaved in ways that tore at the soldiers' understanding of the world. When an elderly prisoner stumbled on the icy ground, a guard reached down, grasped his arm, and lifted him to his feet. There was no mockery, no kick, no cruel smirk, just a curt nod before walking away. Each simple act, ordinary to an American, felt extraordinary to the prisoners. Each gesture challenged everything they had believed about honor, war, and the enemy. Red Cross officials moved through the camp like calm observers of a strange ritual. Clipboards in hand, they watched the intake process with quiet authority. Their presence was disorienting. In Japan, they had been told the Americans would ignore treaties, break rules, and kill without mercy. Here, neutral observers ensured fairness, recorded details, and enforced order. The prisoners' minds spun. Could this really be the same country they had been told was barbaric? The medical checks were thorough. Soldiers were weighed, measured, examined for malnutrition, fever, broken bones, and infections. Many were weak, some could barely stand. Yet at no point were they mocked. In fact, small gestures of care continued. One corporal handed out chalky vitamins, speaking through an interpreter as if the soldiers' lives mattered. The prisoners watched in silence, some shaking their heads, unable to speak. It was overwhelming. For weeks they had imagined the worst. Their minds had rehearsed every horror, beatings, humiliation, and even death. Now they were confronted with the opposite: attention, care, and even warmth. The camp was heated, the barracks lined with wool blankets. They were given new clothes, serviceable uniforms marked PW. The fabric felt strange, soft in ways they had not felt in years. Some slipped into them slowly, hesitating as if acknowledging the uniform meant surrendering a piece of themselves. Others simply breathed in relief, enjoying the warmth for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Still, fear lingered. Every prisoner wondered if this was a trap, a psychological strategy designed to weaken them. Some whispered of deception, plotting to trick them into speaking, into betraying secrets, or into surrendering their warrior spirit. They were cautious, mistrustful, and deeply conflicted. The kindness of the Americans was terrifying in its subtlety. Night fell, and the prisoners lay on the bunks, staring at the ceiling, still unable to trust the calm. They had survived the Pacific jungles, where death lurked behind every tree, where hunger gnawed at their bones. Yet here, alive, fed, and cared for, they were confronted with an entirely different challenge: how to survive when the enemy does not hate you. Even small interactions carried weight. A guard approached, simply asking if a prisoner was cold, offering a blanket with a quiet nod. Soldiers whispered among themselves, debating whether the kindness was real or part of some elaborate plan. Their minds, trained to expect only cruelty, could not comprehend the humanity before them. For the first time, the prisoners realized that captivity could take forms they had never imagined. Safety, food, warmth, and care, all of it felt unnatural. And yet it was real. The psychological shock was profound. They had prepared to die. They had prepared to suffer. But they had never prepared for mercy. In the flickering light of the camp, the prisoners began to understand the strange new rules of this world. Here, humanity existed even behind barbed wire. Here, kindness could exist without consequence. And in that realization, fear took on a new shape, not the fear of death, but the fear of understanding an enemy who did not want to destroy them. It was a lesson more disorienting than any battle, more shocking than any defeat. The prisoners had expected the worst. Instead, they were confronted with the unimaginable: care, order, and a strange, terrifying generosity. Their journey had just begun, and already the world they knew was unraveling. The morning sun reflected off the thick blanket of snow at Camp McCoy, glinting like shards of ice. The prisoners lined up outside the mess hall, their breath visible in the cold air. They had survived jungles, starvation, and the relentless brutality of war, but nothing had prepared them for what awaited inside. Each soldier clutched his tin tray like a shield, expecting the worst. Some trembled, others kept their heads low, every nerve taut. They had been told that captivity meant humiliation, that their first meal would be scraps unfit for animals. Yet the smell that reached their noses was intoxicating, almost insulting. Rich, heavy, smoky scents, meat frying, bread toasting, potatoes sizzling, wafted through the air. They paused, hearts hammering, unsure if the smell was real. The line moved slowly, the prisoners' eyes darting everywhere, searching for signs of cruelty. Guards and cooks moved efficiently, ignoring their stares, carrying trays of food as if it were ordinary, because for Americans, it was. For the Japanese soldiers, it was unbelievable. The first tray reached a soldier with a hand trembling so violently it was a miracle he could hold it. On it lay a hamburger, thick and juicy, with fried potatoes on the side and a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, sweating with condensation. The red label was unfamiliar, the design decorative, almost foreign in its comfort. The prisoner froze, staring at the tray as if it were a trick. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. Could meat be a weapon? Could a sweet drink be a test? He raised the hamburger to his lips with shaking hands, biting slowly as though one wrong move would make it vanish. The taste was overwhelming, rich, greasy, unlike anything he had eaten in months. His eyes widened. He froze mid-chew, tears welling up from shock. The taste of fat, of meat, of richness. It had been a memory long buried beneath hunger and survival. Around him, others leaned forward, whispering, questioning, staring at their own trays. Some soldiers laughed, low, shaky bursts that surprised even them. Others covered their mouths, shoulders shaking, caught between disbelief and joy. The simple act of eating became an emotional battlefield. For men who had gnawed on roots and boiled weeds, the hamburger was more than food. It was proof of another world, a world that contradicted everything they had been taught. The Coca-Cola caused similar astonishment. The first soldier lifted the bottle hesitantly, the fizz startling him. He took a careful sip. Sweetness exploded on his tongue, followed by the strange, sharp burn of carbonation. He coughed and sputtered, then laughed quietly, incredulous. Around him, soldiers observed each other, some daring to sip, others too cautious, holding the strange liquid as though it were a forbidden elixir. Whispers ran down the line. "Meat? They give us meat?" Another muttered, "Is this a trick? Are they trying to weaken us?" The prisoners' minds raced. They had expected cruelty, punishment, humiliation, but not this. This abundance, this normalcy was alien, confusing, almost unbearable. As they settled at long wooden tables, the soldiers continued to process the shock. The food, served without fanfare, without cruelty, without mockery, challenged their deepest beliefs. Here was an enemy who did not hate them, who did not punish them, who treated them with ordinary care. Each bite of the hamburger, each fry eaten, each sip of Coke was a quiet assault on the doctrines they had carried for years. The prisoners' conversations were soft, tentative, as they tried to understand what was happening. Some whispered that the Americans were trying to make them weak, fattening them up to forget their cause. Others suggested a simpler truth. Perhaps the Americans lived like this every day, and this was nothing special, just ordinary life. The concept was so foreign, so inconceivable, that many could not even speak. The mess hall continued its quiet routine. Cooks moved efficiently, preparing meals as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Guards observed without comment, allowing the soldiers to eat in peace. The prisoners could not reconcile the scene with the war raging across the world. Here, behind barbed wire, they were safe, fed, and treated with a calm efficiency that was almost unbearable. Some soldiers pressed their faces into blankets to block the smell, overwhelmed by the richness, the abundance, the shock. Others lingered on each bite, savoring it, almost afraid it would vanish. The taste of meat, fat, sugar, and warmth was more than physical nourishment. It was psychological, disorienting, almost dangerous in its power. By the end of the meal, the soldiers sat back silently. Some folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. A hamburger, fries, and a bottle of soda, ordinary in the hands of Americans, extraordinary in the hands of men who had lived through the Pacific's cruelty. In that moment, the prisoners realized that the war they had known was not only about bullets and blood. It was also about belief, doctrine, and fear. And here, in this quiet, orderly hall, every belief they had held was under siege. The enemy had not fired a shot, but they had already begun to win, not with weapons but with food, order, and simple humanity. The first meal at Camp McCoy was over, but the taste lingered, a haunting reminder that the world could be more complicated than any propaganda. The soldiers had survived battles, jungles, and starvation, but the greatest challenge was yet to come. Surviving a captivity that was nothing like they expected, a captivity that challenged everything they believed about the enemy, honor, and survival. The first days at Camp McCoy passed in a haze of disbelief and quiet tension. The soldiers were alive, fed, and clothed, yet their minds could not fully accept it. Each morning they awoke to the sound of roll call, boots crunching against the frost, rifles pointed from guard towers, voices calling out in crisp, foreign English. It was familiar in rhythm like their own camps back in Japan, yet completely alien in tone. The soldiers stiffened as they lined up, expecting shouts or blows. None came. They exchanged wary glances, hearts still hammering, unsure how to react to a world that seemed orderly and safe. After roll call came breakfast, which was never a punishment, never a test. Hot food was served in generous portions. The smell of cooked eggs, toast, and oatmeal drifted through the hall, filling empty stomachs. The prisoners hesitated, unsure how to behave. Some ate slowly, others barely touched their trays, afraid that indulgence would betray weakness. They had been trained to endure hunger, to survive on scraps. Now food was abundant, and that abundance terrified them more than scarcity ever had. Once the meal was finished, the men were assigned to work details. Some shoveled snow from roads, their muscles stiff from months of malnutrition. Others cut wood, lifted heavy logs, or tended to nearby farms under the watchful eyes of guards. The work was steady, predictable, and tiring but not cruel. They were paid in camp coupons, a form of currency they could use to buy small comforts: soap, writing paper, even candy or cigarettes. The idea that prisoners could earn something, could choose small pleasures, was almost unbearable. It challenged the very notion of captivity. Letters became lifelines. Each man could write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, carefully censored but precious beyond measure. Some hunched over tables, pencil scratching across paper, trying to convey the simple truth: I am alive. Others received replies, fragile envelopes with kanji written in familiar hands, proof that home still existed, that the world outside had not completely forgotten them. Yet for many, silence was a crushing weight, a reminder of families enduring hunger and fear while they ate hot meals behind wire fences. The barracks were another source of disorientation. Heated by stoves, lined with wool blankets, the rooms were warm, safe, almost cozy. Soldiers tested the softness of the mattresses with their hands, some slowly lying down as if to make sure it was real. For the first time in months, their bodies relaxed, their muscles unknotted. But the mind could not rest. Some whispered fears that comfort was a trick, a method to weaken their resolve, to make them forget their emperor and their homeland. Suspicion ran deep. Some prisoners accused others of betraying their honor when they attended English classes or engaged in casual conversation with guards. Loyalty to the emperor was drilled into their bones, a lifelong code they could not abandon lightly. And yet, curiosity flickered. A few men attended the classes, repeating words slowly after the American teacher, savoring the ability to communicate, to understand the strange, foreign world around them. Each new word, each simple exchange felt like both betrayal and survival. Interactions with guards further complicated their emotions. A young soldier named Miller, barely 20, often lingered near the barracks after duty, carrying photographs of his family. He showed them to the prisoners, pointing to a mother, father, and 2 sisters. They did not understand the words, but the images spoke clearly. Some prisoners traced shapes in the dirt, sketching their own villages and homes. Communication happened without words, bridging a chasm of fear and culture. Each small act of shared humanity rattled beliefs that had been hardened for years of war. Outside the wire, resentment was sometimes raw. On farms where prisoners worked, American civilians watched closely, some harboring grief for sons lost in the Pacific. One man spat near a prisoner who bent to pick up a dropped tool. The prisoner froze, tension cracking in his chest, but the guard remained silent, allowing the work to continue without escalation. Not all Americans followed the rules perfectly, but the contrast between law and hatred was stark. Inside the camp, rules protected prisoners from abuse, and the soldiers could not ignore it. Even simple daily routines became a battlefield of the mind. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. Monotony replaced chaos. The absence of combat, of constant threat, allowed the soldiers' thoughts to wander. Memories of fallen comrades, of ambushes and starvation, rose unbidden. Some wrote in diaries, pouring fear, guilt, and confusion onto paper. Others debated quietly with bunkmates about survival, honor, and the strange kindness of the enemy. Religion offered another layer of complexity. Some prisoners gathered to recite prayers to ancestors, clinging to tradition and familiarity. Others watched American chaplains lead services, participating cautiously or merely observing. The gestures were foreign, but the humanity behind them was unmistakable. Faith, ritual, and hope became common ground, even across vast cultural divides. The psychological impact of abundance was profound. Soldiers who had expected suffering were confronted with comfort. Their stomachs were filled, their bodies warmed, their wounds treated. Each act of care contradicted the stories they had carried for years, that the Americans were cruel, barbaric, and untrustworthy. And yet, the reality of Camp McCoy forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Survival was not shameful, and kindness did not diminish their honor. By the end of the first week, the prisoners had begun to adjust outwardly. They moved through routines with practiced efficiency, obeyed orders without incident, and began to participate cautiously in camp life. But inside, confusion and fear simmered. The world they had known, one of constant battle and absolute loyalty, was unraveling, replaced by a strange, unsettling order. The soldiers were safe, fed, and clothed, yet the greatest enemy now was not outside the wire. It was the peace itself, the quiet, the routine, and the unbearable freedom to think. The first shock of kindness had passed. The soldiers were beginning to understand that captivity could be humane, that the enemy could be orderly, and that life did not always come with pain and death. And yet, the tension remained, a quiet, insistent reminder that this was only the beginning. The prisoners had not yet faced the meal that would truly shake their beliefs. The first American dinner served with a hamburger and Coca-Cola. Weeks turned into months, and the Japanese prisoners at Camp McCoy settled into a rhythm that was both predictable and disorienting. Their bodies adjusted to warmth, regular meals, and steady sleep. Yet their minds churned in confusion, struggling with a truth they had never been trained to understand. The enemy was not cruel. The Americans did not seek to break them with violence, but to manage them with care, rules, and routine. Every morning began with the same ritual: boots scraping snow, roll call, inspection, and breakfast. Soldiers were clothed in uniforms that fit, provided with wool blankets, and assigned work that was hard but not brutal. They shoveled snow, cut wood, and tended farms under watchful guards. For the first time in years, physical survival was not the ultimate goal. Instead, their thoughts wandered freely, sometimes painfully. Letters from home arrived in thin envelopes, filled with worries, survival tips, and occasional small blessings. Some prisoners received news of relatives starving under air raids. Others learned that family members had survived, but lived in poverty and fear. Each letter was a mix of hope and guilt, a reminder that life outside the wire continued in hardship. Small acts of humanity within the camp tore at the prisoners' sense of honor. A young American guard, barely older than some of the soldiers, lingered after duty to show photographs of his family. Prisoners who saw mothers, fathers, and children in these pictures were struck by a quiet, impossible emotion. Some traced images of their own homes in the dirt, attempting to bridge the vast cultural and linguistic gap with simple sketches. Though the words could not be shared, the human connection was unmistakable. Interactions like these created unease. Some prisoners whispered accusations against their comrades, calling English classes or friendly gestures with guards acts of betrayal. "We are weakening ourselves," one muttered. "Every word we learn, every smile we return chips away at our loyalty." Yet curiosity and survival pushed others forward, forcing them to engage, to ask questions, to attempt simple conversation. The soldiers were caught between two worlds, one of loyalty to the emperor and one of humanity that defied their doctrine. Religion added another layer to the moral confusion. Some gathered in the barracks to pray to ancestors, holding on to traditions that had anchored them through jungle campaigns and battles. Others attended American chaplain services, sitting quietly, observing rituals they did not fully understand, but sensing warmth and hope in the simple act of gathering. The mixture of faiths, rituals, and kindness was alien, yet it brought a strange, quiet comfort. Even routine work became a moral test. Prisoners on farm details observed abundance they had never imagined. Barns full of livestock, tractors plowing fields, children laughing in the snow. They were safe, fed, and productive. Yet each sight brought guilt. Back home, families suffered hunger and fear while they were clothed, fed, and warm. One soldier whispered to another, "We live better here than our families do. How can that be honorable?" The Red Cross inspections amplified the prisoners' internal conflict. Neutral observers asked questions, checked rations, and noted conditions. When the soldiers admitted to being treated well, shame and disbelief surged. They had been taught that surrender was disgrace, yet truth forced them to acknowledge that the enemy could follow rules, provide comfort, and maintain dignity. It was an unspoken moral puzzle. How could enemies be humane, and how should one reconcile survival with honor? The tension escalated during casual interactions. One prisoner, handed a small chocolate bar from the camp canteen, marveled at its abundance. "In Japan," he whispered, "this is medicine." Another, who had once scorned American food, tasted it slowly, savoring the sweetness, yet fearing it eroded his resolve. Simple acts of kindness, a blanket, a shared photograph, a candy bar, were psychological battles, more challenging than any battlefield. Children visiting the camp introduced another layer of moral complexity. On a snowy afternoon, a small girl approached the wire, offering a candy bar to a Japanese prisoner. He froze, unarmed, vulnerable, and caught between fear and instinct. Slowly he accepted the gift, bowing slightly in a gesture of respect. The child smiled and skipped away. That moment haunted him, a simple act of innocence and kindness that struck deeper than any weapon ever could. Even guards carried the weight of moral clarity. Some enforced rules strictly yet without cruelty. Others lingered, offering small gestures, a nod, a quiet word, an explanation of life beyond the wire. For the prisoners, every act was a lesson in an unfamiliar reality, that humanity could exist even amid war, that survival did not require cruelty, and that kindness could be as powerful as any weapon. At night, the barracks were filled with quiet reflection. Soldiers whispered debates. "Is survival betrayal?" one asked. "Or is it a gift we must accept?" Another replied, voice cracking, "We live. That is our truth. How we carry it, that is ours to decide." These discussions, carried in hushed tones, revealed a deep internal struggle. Their beliefs, hardened by years of indoctrination, were clashing with reality. And yet, even as they struggled, a fragile understanding began to emerge. Humanity could survive even behind barbed wire, and honor could coexist with survival, even in a strange enemy land. By the end of the 5th month, Camp McCoy had become more than a prison. It was a place of moral confrontation, a battlefield of the mind. The soldiers had faced bullets, starvation, and despair, but now they faced an enemy far more difficult to understand: kindness, order, and the quiet insistence of humanity. Every small act, the distribution of food, the sharing of photographs, the offering of candy, was a lesson, a challenge, a reminder that war was not only fought with weapons, but with choices, morality, and unexpected empathy. In that quiet, snowy camp, the prisoners discovered a terrifying truth. Surviving with their humanity intact might be the hardest battle they would ever face. Winter of 1945 pressed on, cold and relentless. Inside the fences of Camp McCoy, the Japanese prisoners continued their routine: roll call, work, meals, letters, and quiet reflection. On the surface, life was predictable. Beneath it, every man wrestled with an invisible war within, between loyalty to an emperor they revered and the reality of a humane enemy who fed them, clothed them, and treated them with dignity. Then one morning rumors arrived. Rumors that cities in Japan were burning, that the Allied forces were advancing, that the war might finally be nearing its end. The news trickled slowly, fragments of destruction, whispered fears. For the prisoners, it was both distant and personal. Their homes, families, and villages were under threat. They were safe, yet they carried the guilt of abundance while loved ones suffered. Each new report cut deeper, sharpening the contrast between life behind the wire and life in Japan. Days passed with mounting tension until the unimaginable happened. News of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the camp. Most soldiers did not fully understand what an atomic bomb entailed, yet the horror was clear. Families annihilated, cities leveled, lives erased in moments. Shock spread like wildfire through the barracks. Silence followed, profound and unbroken. Men stared blankly, unable to speak, their previous struggles dwarfed by the sheer scale of the catastrophe. And then came the final, crushing truth: Japan had surrendered. The announcement fell upon Camp McCoy like a weight that could not be lifted. For men who had carried the belief that surrender was a sin, that death was preferable, the news was unbearable. Some wept quietly, shoulders shaking under thin blankets. Others sat in stunned silence, staring at the floor or ceiling, unable to reconcile the collapse of their nation with their own survival. The guards did not gloat. They simply maintained routines: roll call, meals, inspections. The calm continuity was unbearable in its own way. One prisoner whispered bitterly, "They treat us the same, whether we are warriors or defeated, they do not see our shame." The observation rang with painful truth. The enemy had not celebrated, they had continued their humanity. The prisoners realized that the real victory of the Americans was not in bullets or bombs, but in their steadfast adherence to order and law. Repatriation preparations began swiftly. The Red Cross organized lists, transportation, and schedules. Soldiers were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and briefings about the journey home. Yet the prospect of returning to Japan was not triumphant. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, survivors surviving on scraps. The thought of facing a homeland they had defended with honor, now defeated, filled them with dread. On the morning of transfer, prisoners filed out, carrying small bundles of personal belongings. Some held wooden carvings they had crafted in idle hours. Others clutched letters from home, stained with tears and sweat. As they passed through the camp gates one last time, many glanced back. It was not nostalgia that drew them to look, but confusion. The place where cruelty was expected had offered warmth, food, and humanity. The psychological victory of the enemy had been complete. The journey across the Pacific was long and heavy. Men huddled together on crowded ships, staring at the endless water, wondering what awaited them in Japan. Fear of judgment, accusations of cowardice, and the crushing weight of witnessing their homeland destroyed mingled with the lingering memory of hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and small acts of kindness. One soldier scribbled in his worn notebook, "I thought the enemy would break me with violence. Instead he broke me with food, warmth, and care. I cannot erase it. It will follow me home like a shadow." When the prisoners finally set foot on Japanese soil, the reality struck harder than any battlefield wound. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, homes burned. Some wives and children had survived on grass, tree bark, and meager rations. Others had not survived at all. The returning soldiers faced accusations of weakness and dishonor, judged for having lived as prisoners. Yet they carried stories no one at home wanted to hear, stories of a humane enemy who fed them, healed them, and treated them with rules rather than rage. As they reintegrated into a destroyed nation, the men struggled to reconcile what they had seen with what they had been taught. In whispers to their sons and grandsons years later, some admitted the hardest truth: the enemy was human, kindness could exist in war, and survival was not shameful. Others buried these memories deep, too painful to share. Even in silence, the lessons endured. Humanity could survive behind barbed wire. Rules and compassion could wield more power than cruelty and violence. Small acts, a guard showing photographs, a child offering candy, a cook sliding a hamburger across a tray, left marks that outlasted the roar of cannons. Camp McCoy and other camps like it left an enduring legacy not in battles fought or victories won, but in the quiet, disorienting moments where food, order, and kindness collided with fear and loyalty. For the prisoners, captivity revealed a profound truth: survival with humanity intact was possible, and sometimes kindness was harder to carry than cruelty. Years later, one survivor would tell his son, "I learned in America that cruelty you can fight, kindness you remember. War can take everything, but it cannot erase the power of small acts of humanity." The memory of Camp McCoy, of hamburgers and Coke, of warmth in a world of cold, remained, a paradoxical testament that even amid the darkness of war, the human spirit could endure, and that the enemy could, against all expectations, teach the hardest lessons of all. Years passed, but the memory of Camp McCoy never faded for the men who had survived behind its barbed wire. The war outside had ended, empires had fallen, cities rebuilt, and nations had moved on. Yet inside their minds, the lessons of those months in Wisconsin lingered, vivid and haunting. For the Japanese prisoners, the experience was not only about survival, it was about understanding a truth that would challenge every belief they had carried since childhood. The soldiers remembered their first steps off the train into the biting cold. They had expected brutality, violence, and death. Instead, they found warmth, order, and an enemy who treated them according to rules. That initial shock had been the first lesson. Reality often defies expectation, and assumptions built on fear and propaganda can crumble in a single moment. As they adjusted to daily life in the camp, they discovered another layer of truth. The routines, roll call, work details, meals, letters, were designed not to break them but to teach patience, endurance, and the value of structure. In a world without chaos, they were forced to confront themselves. What did honor mean when survival was possible without suffering? Could loyalty coexist with gratitude toward those they had been taught to hate? These questions had no easy answers. Humanity often arrived in small, quiet gestures. A guard showing a photograph of his family. A child offering a candy bar through the wire. A cook sliding a hot hamburger and a cold bottle of Coca-Cola across the mess hall counter. The prisoners had faced bullets, starvation, and bombing, yet these simple acts of kindness left the deepest marks. They were lessons in a foreign morality, that compassion could exist even among enemies, and that strength could be found in care, not only in combat. Letters from home added complexity to their understanding. Some brought joy, others grief, and many brought guilt. Families in Japan struggled to survive under bombing and famine, while the prisoners lived comfortably behind wire fences. Each letter reminded them that survival was not simple, that the comforts they received were not without psychological cost. Hunger, fear, and devotion to duty had been replaced by moral and emotional dilemmas. The prisoners' reflections often turned inward. In the quiet of the barracks, they debated the meaning of honor and loyalty. Some argued that accepting food, warmth, and kindness was a betrayal. Others countered that living and witnessing humanity were not weaknesses, but lessons. Through these internal battles, they began to reconcile the paradox of war, that the enemy could display compassion and that survival did not erase their identity or dignity. Religion and culture further deepened their reflections. Traditional prayers and rituals provided continuity, a thread connecting them to home. Observing American chaplains and services offered a new perspective. Different gods, different practices, yet the same human longing for hope and solace. In this convergence of faith, soldiers glimpsed a universal truth: war might divide nations, but the human spirit remained the same. The final months in the camp brought the bittersweet reality of repatriation. Soldiers were given clean uniforms, medical exams, and prepared for transport back to a homeland ravaged by war. They left the camp carrying more than belongings. They carried stories, memories, and the enduring lessons of kindness amid conflict. They had survived, yes, but they had also been changed. Upon returning to Japan, the men faced a society that could not fully comprehend their experience. Cities lay in ruins, families were scattered, and some had perished. The returning soldiers were often met with suspicion or disdain for having survived as prisoners. Yet within them remained an inner knowledge. They had witnessed a form of humanity that transcended national boundaries, a moral lesson more enduring than any battlefield victory. Years later, when survivors told their children about Camp McCoy, they spoke not only of war, but of the paradoxes that had reshaped their understanding of the world. They spoke of the hamburgers, Coca-Cola, blankets, and quiet gestures that revealed an enemy capable of care. They shared how moral strength could coexist with survival, and that witnessing kindness in an unlikely place could leave a mark deeper than bullets ever could. The legacy of Camp McCoy is subtle but profound. It is not found in statistics, victories, or battles. It is found in the quiet, disorienting moments when the prisoners realized that the enemy could show mercy, that law could restrain cruelty, and that humanity could endure even amidst the horrors of war. It is found in the knowledge that kindness can be more difficult to bear than cruelty, because it challenges beliefs, confounds expectations, and forces reflection. For those who survived, the camp became a teacher. Its lessons were written in memory, that fear and suspicion can be overcome, that survival is not shameful, and that the small choices of individuals, an offered blanket, a shared photograph, a simple meal, can outlast the noise of cannons. In the end, Camp McCoy was more than a prison. It was a place where war taught humanity, where enemy and prisoner alike learned that even in darkness, light could exist, and where a simple hamburger and a bottle of Coke could change the way men saw the world, long after the war had ended. For generations to come, the story of Camp McCoy serves as a reminder: wars end, nations rise and fall. But small acts of compassion, kindness, and moral courage leave a mark that endures far beyond the battlefield. And sometimes the hardest lessons come not from bullets and bombs, but from the quiet persistence of humanity itself.